Hello and welcome to Game 13 in the World Chess Championship between 18-year-old challenger Gukesh Damaraju with the white pieces today and the 32-year-old world champion from China, Ding Liren. So this is the 13th game out of 14. Let's see who will be victorious today. Who will be lucky or unlucky in game 13? All right, here we go. E4 is played by the young challenger. So, a good choice if you're trying to make something happen here at the end of this world championship, trying to go for a win. And the game continues with E6. So the world champion playing the more solid French defense here. And the game continues with D4. If your opponent lets you grab the center with both pawns, then why not go ahead and do it? So the center is very important. So the world champion fights back in the center, attacking this pawn. And now we have the pawn protected by knight to C3, a common move in the French defense here. What will the world champion play here? It looks like the classical variation with knight to F6, adding more pressure along with the pawn on this E4 pawn. So now an interesting choice here by the world championship challenger. He presses forward, attacking the knight, sending this knight retreating back. And what has the young challenger achieved here? Well, he gains space in the center, more freedom and mobility for his pieces while cramping his opponent's position. And by sending that knight retreating, instead of trying to gain a lead in development, he drops back with this knight. Now, why would he do this? Blocking in his bishop here and moving a piece twice in the opening. Usually you don't want to do that. Well, this allows him to push the C pawn here, fortifying this central D4 pawn, which is the base of the pawn chain for the moment. And a lot of times in the French, you'll counter black will by pushing here and attacking the base of this chain. So if that happens, this pawn can push forward on C3, fortifying the center. So sure enough, we have the typical French attack here, pushing the C pawn and applying pressure to D4 here. So the game continues with C3 fortifying the center. The knight develops, adding even more pressure. And now black is ahead at the moment in piece development. So the game continues with A3 here. An interesting move, preventing pieces from landing here on B4. If there's an exchange on D4 here, then maybe white could press forward to B4 here, gaining space on the queen side. So let's see what happens. The game continues with bishop developing and black is ready to castle. And now the bishop decides to develop the E3 to further fortify this D4 pawn, but also adding pressure to this pawn, a possible attack. But black is okay at the moment with a knight and bishop all fortifying this pawn. So the game continues with an inaccuracy played by the world champion here. It looks like the computer preferred A5, gaining space on the queen side and discouraging the B4 pawn push. But what does this knight move do? Well, there's a possibility of jumping forward onto this outpost for the moment, attacking the bishop maybe and the pawn at the same time. Probably forcing the bishop maybe to retreat back to defend the pawn. So the game continues with the best move being found, knight to F4. So interesting move here. It allows the bishop to develop. So let's see what happens. It looks like an exchange of pawns in the center. So now we have this French defense pawn structure where the center is closed and play will continue on the wings. Maybe this pawn will push in the future, attacking. Also, a rook could try and take control of the c file. This open c file may become a battleground. All right, the knight does jump onto this outpost, forking the bishop and the pawn here. So, what will the young challenger do? Well, he decides to capture, and so that's probably why he moved his knight up here to f4 to unleash the bishop. And now that he captures this knight, we have a recapture, and black does gain a pawn majority of 3 versus 2 on the queen side, which could be an endgame advantage. But we'll have to see if this pawn, pressed up the board here, if it will become harder to defend. Let's see what happens. Also, white is left with this backwards pawn that may become a weakness. At the moment, it's protected well enough with bishop and queen, and we have an attack of knight and queen. So the game continues with knight developing and a mistake by the young challenger here. This dropped his advantage from 0.84 if he would have played queen to g4 here, attacking this pawn. So now, after this move, white is still ahead, but his advantage is smaller now. So after this mistake, let's see if the world champion can take advantage of it. No, he plays an inaccuracy. b5 here, so fortifying his pawn. A defensive, protective move. And it looks like just castling kingside would have been better for the world champion, according to the computer. Now, of course, the computer is not always correct. It is good at tactics and calculation, exchanges and combinations, but strategy is where human players still can outplay a computer. So let's see what the world champion has in mind after this move. First, the young challenger castles kingside, as does black. And then we have knight to c3, targeting this pawn, bringing the knight up a little bit further towards the center. He's controlling these valuable squares in the middle of the board. And so the game continues with rook developing and protecting the pawn at the same time. So if you can find moves that do more than one thing, that's usually a good idea. The rook develops off of its original square. It didn't have many options here, but now it has a little bit more scope, but it's also protecting this pawn. And so the game continues with the best move being found. Generally, you don't want to place a knight on the edge of the board, but here the computer says that's best. Aiming at this pawn in front of the king. Perhaps the queen is threatening to press forward here and threaten a mate in one. Of course, that could be blocked with a pawn push, but that would create some weaknesses on the king side, perhaps. So the game continues with the world champion finding the best move in the position according to the computer. f5 here, gaining space on the king side. There is the option to capture en passant here. Let's see what the young challenger does. He does capture en passant. And then now we have the bishop recapturing. Will the young challenger capture with the knight and knock out his opponent's bishop pair? Generally, that's a good idea, especially if you do not have your bishop pair any longer. And so the young challenger plays a mistake here, and the game has swung slightly in black's favor now. This move looks pretty dangerous. It is attacking an unprotected knight, but we have a rook lined up on the queen here. So let's see what happens after this move. Well, now the queen to e8 move played by the world champion is an inaccuracy, it looks like. It might have been better to play knight takes d4 here, which would attack the queen. Then we'd have a series of exchanges probably. There is the option of capturing here, maybe, but then you have to watch out because the rook would be able to capture. Well, let's just see what how the game continues here. All right, we have knight capturing with check by the young challenger. So after a recapture, the queen is under attack. And now queen drops back to e2, the best move in the position. So what do we have going on here at this point? Black has a 3 versus 2 pawn majority, which, like I said earlier, could be an endgame advantage. Also, white has this isolated queen pawn, which can become weak as more pieces are exchanged off of the board. So the game continues with queen developing, lining up on the opponent's king. And I mentioned this in previous games during this World Championship, how a common theme that occurs quite a bit is when pieces line up on more valuable pieces. So here we have the queen lining up on the king, even though there's a pawn in between. But you never know when things could happen where this pawn might want to cover these squares, but it cannot because it's pinned by this queen move. So the game continues with pawn pressing forward, gaining a little bit of space. Maybe with the possibility of pushing the G pawn and gaining space on the king side. But also this blunts the scope of the rook here down this file, especially if black decides that in the future he wants to double rooks on this f file. So let's see how the game continues. We have a rook retreat, which the computer states is good, but rook to f5 moving here would have been best, it looks like. So game continues with the worst placed piece in the position. This rook that was on a1 centralizes, helps fortify this isolated pawn, maybe with the idea of pushing that pawn, trying to exchange. But now, black has an isolated pawn as well. So, if they exchanged, it would kind of get rid of the weakness on both sides of these isolated pawns. All right, knight retreats back. An inaccuracy. It looks like rook to b7 would have been a little bit better. From there, the rook would have a future option of centralizing or even doubling rooks at some point. So the game continues with a brilliant move being found by the young challenger here. Bishop to f4, placing the rook on a square where it can just be, it appears that it could just be captured. But why is this move so brilliant? Let's find out. It looks like the best response is probably a rook to b6, as this bishop is attacking. But why not just capture here? What would happen if this were captured? Well, it looks like if that bishop were captured, that would actually be a blunder because of this possible queen to e5 move, forking both of these rooks. So the best move now would be rook to b6, and then the queen could go ahead and capture the rook and be ahead and exchange here. So, of course, in the game, the world champion is too smart to fall for that fairly simple tactic. So the best move is found, rook to b6. And now it looks like this bishop can be threatened. There is a threat of capture. So in this position, the best move is found, bishop to c7, attacking the rook here. So the rook retreats and counterattacks at the same time. So the game continues with bishop retreating, but at the same time, as I mentioned, lining up on a more valuable rook and pinning this knight at the same time. So the game continues with rook defending, and then an exchange. Apparently this is an inaccuracy. Rook at f to e1 would have been better, creating a battery and placing some pressure on this pawn, although it is defended by bishop and queen here. But if we go back, so it looks like that was well, now the computer is also recommending queen to e5 as a possibility instead, but it looks like centralizing the rook here would have been better. So after this capture, well now, before I continue, let's see what actually happens. Rook captures. Now the rooks are working together in tandem, protecting one another. And also in this position, we have bishop versus knight and pawns on both sides of the board. So in the end game, a bishop with pawns on both sides of the board can be an advantage for the world champion here. So let's see what Gukesh decides to do. He centralizes his queen, usually a good strategy. Pawn pushes forward, protecting the b5 pawn and releasing this rook from guard duty. So now we have the pawn pushing forward here, trying, young challenger Gukesh is trying to get rid of his isolated pawn. But after the capture, which is best, that also helps black get rid of their isolated pawn. So those weaknesses come off the board. We have a queen capture with check. So that does force black to decide, what should I do next here? And let's see what he does. A queen blocking move, excellent by the computer, but maybe rook to e6 would be a little bit better. So the game continues with the queen sidestepping, avoiding a trade as Gukesh wants to continue to fight to try and get a win. He is ahead here by the equivalent of 3/4 of a pawn, but material is actually even at this point. White has a 3 versus 2 advantage in pawns on the king side. Black has a queen side majority. So often a queen side majority can be a good advantage if you can break that pawn through and get a passed pawn in the endgame where the king is far away from that pawn. So the game continues with rook retreating back, guarding the back rank from possible checks, maybe by this rook. The game continues with an attack on the queen here. Interesting choice. Apparently this is an excellent move. The computer says maybe it would have been slightly better to bring the rook on f1 over. But either way, now there is this possibility of exchanging the queen for both rooks here. So after capture, the rook would capture with a check, but the queen would be attacking the bishop. And will the world champion trade a queen for 2 rooks here? Let's find out. No. A missed opportunity. Apparently, it would have been best to capture, giving up your queen. But perhaps the world champion did not want to have to worry about this queen roaming around the board, threatening the king, threatening forks. It would have been attacking the bishop here. The rook would have had to retreat back to where it was, this rook, after the queen exchange. So a missed opportunity here. We can take a quick look at this. I might as well. So best would have been to capture, and then after recapture, capture, the king would have to move up to f2, but now the queen is threatening to capture the bishop with check. So the best move, of course, would be to retreat, guarding the bishop and the back rank. And then the knight would be able to jump forward here, and let's see, what could happen next. Now they're saying that's an inaccuracy, that it would have been better to jump here instead. That would close out the E file for this rook in the future. Now it looks like rook at B to E7 would be best, doubling the rooks here. And the game could continue with a fork. So after this forking move, a queen counterattack would be good here. But this allows queen to C7. Rook attacks the queen. And then this queen could just move again. Let's see. Or, apparently this, they're saying that is the best move. Knight captures here. All right. Because then if we have a capture, recapture, and then you go into this endgame, white has a slight advantage. Maybe because his king can run up to the center here. But as I mentioned, it would be a bishop versus knight endgame, and the bishop has a slight advantage of being able to zip across the board faster than a knight. Anyway, that's a possibility. So let's see what actually happened in the game. We had this missed opportunity by the world champion. The knight jumps forward, so Gukesh responds with a missed opportunity. Apparently, the best option would have been to capture here. And then after queen captures, we have knight to E4, jumping forward, blocking the scope of the queen. And then it looks like rook to D7. The rook would grab the open file, but the knight is doing a good job of preventing the rook from grabbing the 7th rank. And after this, it looks like, let's see, knight to D6 is recommended, the fork. But then after, let's see, queen to D8, queen to D5 check would be best, king to F8, queen to F5, and then king back to G8 is best. And now queen to E6 or D5, the computer is bouncing back and forth. You could press up up the board. The computer now saying this would be best, attacking the king. King over to F8, and now what? Rook to D1. Getting ready to fight for this open file. So rook to C7, a discovered attack on the queen. Queen to D5 here. And then rook back to, over to E7, trying to grab this open file. So anyway, I won't go too much further. Let's finish this game out and see what actually happened. So in the game, we had 2 missed opportunities by, one by each player. We have a doubling of rook and queen, creating a battery here. So the game continues with a fork. The knight forking the queen, the bishop, the rook. So the game continues with a counterattack on the queen. A good strategy, if your opponent attacks, but you can counterattack, you can ignore what they do in favor of an even stronger attack. Although here it's even. If the queen captures, rook would capture here. So let's see what happens. We have the queen centralizing. So once again, Gukesh, he finds the best move and he avoids trading the queens off the board. Really fighting for a win. He's ahead here by the equivalent of half a pawn, even though material is even. So it looks like the world champion attacks the queen here with queen to F6, putting the question to the young challenger of whether or not he wants to exchange queens. So no, we have a queen centralizing move, which is good, but apparently it would have been better to just go ahead and capture. But I don't know. This game is looking like it's headed towards a draw. The king retreats into the corner, and now the rook centralizes, but white's advantage seems to be dwindling here. So the game continues with a rook under fire. Rooks double, the best move in the position. So capture, recapture. Apparently, it would have been better to capture with the queen. This inaccuracy kind of evens the game up even more. But I understand why the world champion, or excuse me, the challenger played this way. He wanted to avoid queen trades, continuing to fight for trying to go for the win if he can. So here we have pawn pushing forward, the best move in the position. It gives the king a little escape hatch here. And the queen steps over here, continues to protect the knight. But, by going here, that could add pressure to the knight, especially if the queen stayed where it was. The knight would be pinned to the queen. So anyway, the game continues with bishop getting out of the line of fire. Knight drops back and counterattacks the queen. So now we have queen stepping forward, threatening to infiltrate into the position, with a possible check here, and then picking off a pawn. What will the challenger do? So he steps forward, and at this point, it looks like the game is dead even after this move. So, and also, if the queen would have gone here, he would not have been able to capture this pawn. I take that back because the queen is lined up on the rook there. Okay, so the game continues with bishop pressing forward, attacking the knight. And then we have queen centralizing. Once again, that theme of lining up on a more valuable piece, even if there's a piece or a pawn in between. So the rook defends, because also there was the threat of mate in one there if the queen captured, backed up by the rook. So rook defends, and now we have the pawn pressing forward, giving white an additional escape hatch in the corner. So now we have check. The king decides to go towards the center, usually a good idea, but now the queen is covering that pawn. So the game continues with capture, rook captures, and the pawn majority presses forward here. And after capture, is that such a great idea? Let's find out. Now, what did that do? It does allow these pawns to be broken apart, and now the world champion can capture here, and there'll be a passed pawn over here on the queen side. So the game continues with capture. The king tries to get up and into the action, pressing up the board, and now the queen steps out of the way of this passed pawn that's going to try and start marching up the board. So rook grabbing the 7th rank, usually a great idea, and maintains that threat of mate in one, and forcing this rook to remain here for guard duty. So here comes the passed pawn on the A file. Will this pawn become a dangerous threat? We have a rook stepping behind the passed pawn. Behind a pawn, not the passed pawn. But it's generally good for the rook to step behind a pawn, and target it from the rear here. So the game continues with queen stepping forward, trying to trade the queens off the board. And what will the young challenger do here? He once again avoids that trade, guards this pawn at the same time. Another great strategy here is to place your queen on this diagonal that helps guard your king. because a lot of times in a fianchettoed position or any position where a queen at some point could grab this diagonal and check your king, an unexpected check could be a nasty surprise if you overlook it. So here we go. Queen centralizes. Rook and queen are piling up on this pawn. So the game continues with the queen to c6 move, the best move in the position. So now, how will things continue here? The best move is found, capturing with the queen. And after pawn is captured, the passed pawn on the queen side is protected, but we have rook getting behind the pawn, and so the game continues with a check. King steps into the corner here on h2, and now the queen presses forward here, threatening white's queen, asking for another exchange. So what will happen? We do have the exchange after the pawn recaptures. Rook gets behind the passed pawn, and there's no way to protect it. So after rook presses forward, we have capture and rook to a2, pinning this g pawn to the king. So at this point, there's a 3 versus 2 pawn majority here. But the computer says the game is pretty much a draw here. The rook is preventing this g-pawn from moving forward. And also, if the king tries to get up into the action, the king will have to stay back here and guard this g-pawn. So the game continues with king marching forward. Black does likewise. The rook steps up here, creating a wall to try and prevent the black king from moving forward. And so king steps up, pawn presses forward, and now we have a sidestepping maneuver where the king does head towards the center of the board, but also from here he can blockade the unopposed pawn. And generally that's what you want to do when you have a pawn majority, push the unopposed pawn. So the king centralizes here, the best move in the position. Rook steps a little bit closer, and the game continues with a pawn pressing forward. And now we have a check. The king steps further up the board, but once again, he'll be stuck guarding this pawn. So the game continues with rook maneuvering to a3, and the computer says this is good, but it prefers g6. And that move would prevent the white king from moving forward in the future. So the game continues with h4 here. A good move, although it looks like f5 is preferred by the computer. And so the game continues with rook to c3. And now we have a check by the young challenger. The king steps back. The unopposed pawn is pressing further up the board. And now a check, forcing a decision to be made here. Do you step over here, protecting this g3 pawn, or do you capture? But then, after a recapture by the rook, white's king would be kind of trapped on the edge of the board, perhaps. But let's see what happens. King stays towards the center, the best move in the position. We have a check, and the king drops back. Check again. Will we go to a draw by repetition of position? A check, and it looks like we might. So, yes, the position was repeated 3 times, and we have a draw. So, interesting game. It looks like the young challenger had some opportunities, perhaps. He had an advantage and the possibility of a bigger advantage, but the world champion was able to hang in there and hold a draw. After 13 games, we have a tied world championship going into the final game tomorrow. I hope you stick around with me and are excited to see how things will finish. If they draw tomorrow, then they will go to, I believe, maybe the following day. They will have a tiebreaker round of, I believe, rapid games. And if those are tied, they could go to blitz games. So stick around for the action. Feel free to leave comments as always. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.